thank you to all of you for being here. I'm delighted to moderate this important panel on the Finnish and Swedish path to NATO and the lessons learned. But firstly, let me introduce you to our distinguished panelists. Gunilla Herolf, Senior Associate Research Fellow of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, who came all over from Sweden to join us for this important discussion. Tornike Parulava, Mr. Tornike Parulava, the Director of the Security Policy and Euro-Atlantic Integration Department of the Georgian Foreign Ministry. For those who are working in Georgia, a very familiar face. Next to him, Dr. Bakur Kvashilava, Dean of School of Law and Politics and the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. And last but not the least, Colonel Harri Paldanius, Defense Attaché of Finland to Türkiye, Lebanon and Georgia, who also joined us from Ankara today. So thank you to all of you for making time for this timely discussion, because Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has brought fundamental changes for the European and global security, but also has shattered the security and stable environment of Europe. The war in Ukraine has completely transformed the international order and made politicians rethink the notion of national defense and security. Well, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has also urged Finland and Sweden to apply for NATO membership. I believe that, well, for decades the countries have applied non-alignment, so it has been a great shift for them. The Finnish and Swedish integration path is a very interesting, but at the same, a crucial development for aspirant countries such as Georgia. And today we will be zooming in exactly on those developments. And without any further ado, let me kick off the discussion with posing some of the questions. And at the end, I will give the floor to the audience to ask questions as well. So, with my first question, I will address to the Finnish representative, Colonel Harri Paldanius. First of all, congratulations with the successful path to NATO. Well, Finland's formal accession path to NATO was a culmination of 11-month membership path, and on 4th April of 2023, the Finnish flag has been hoisted in the headquarters. It seems obvious that the changed policy of Finland is triggered by the changed security environment and by the invasion of Ukraine. In previous years, although we have seen various moments when Russia has been aggressive towards its neighbors, for example, the war in Georgia, for example, the annexation of Crimea, but it is now when this moment when Finland decided to join NATO and not before. So please, could you explain why it was the right moment now to set a step forward? Thank you.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First of all, the Finnish path to NATO was not 11 months. It was more than 20 years run, with 11 months sprint at the end across the finishing line. So it took 20 years from 1994 joining the PFP program. So it is not a fast one. It's really a long process for us. So, and using all the NATO programs, taking the full advantage here, as Alexander told us, also use the tools what you have to be ready. And that's what we did. We utilized every single tool given us, and we wanted to do it as a nation, even though we were looking to be military, non-allied nation at that time. Going to how the decision came, so our president, Mr. Sauli Niinistö, outlined his security policy, that the Finnish security policy was based on 4 pillars. Credible national defense was the number one, so 280,000 soldiers, 1,500 field artillery PCs, 350 tanks and whatever it is, but that was the number one. Second one was Western relations and Western integration. European Union membership being the main one in this one. Then very important for us was the transatlantic relations with United States, NATO partnerships, and then deep Nordic cooperation, and here also especially very close cooperation with Sweden in defense issues. The third one was then relationship with Russia, and that's high-level dialogue with Russian decision makers. That was commercial relations with Russia, and that was also cultural and social relations between the people. We were always counting on that one. And the fourth one, once again mentioned, was the rule-based international order. United Nations, the trust on United Nations, and the way that the international world works on certain set of rules and laws instead of total anarchy or just on the strength of somebody or one nation. And I will say that the first indication came 080808, when we all know what happened here. But unfortunately, the whole of Europe forgot that very fast. We're still looking Russia as a strategic partner, as we are looking now China as a strategic competitor. So partner and competitor can fastly change to something totally different. But what really started to change was 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and then the Russian proxy war at eastern Ukraine. There you saw 2 out of the 4 pillars started to crumble in our security policy. Russia and the relations with Russia started to deteriorate, and we once again saw that the international rule-based order didn't work. A nation can do with whatever it wants to, and the international community is really hard to stop it. But still, the nation itself, as Finland, wasn't ready for NATO membership. As we all know, one of the prerequisites for NATO membership is the national and the people's support for that one, and that did not change. 2021 came, and then Putin started to make his ultimatums on NATO should not enlarge, and European Union and Europe used to have a totally different security structure. For us, what it meant, we were told that we could not join the NATO. We were always saying that Finland has this NATO possibility, and we will hold it, we will use it if it's needed. But so far we see no reason to do that. And then 1922, 24 February, the Russian onslaught to Ukraine. And that was then the thing that when our president said that now the mask has been taken off, and only we see is the face of war. And before that, the populist support for NATO was about 3 to 10 people were pro. In overnight, we went from 3 to 10 to 8 to 10 pro-NATO for joining. And actually, it was the people who decided for the politicians and not the politicians for the people. So the populist support has to be for these type of events. So that's how we went there.
Thank you, and you very rightly pointed out that the real work, the hard work has been done before those 11 months, and that's also the reason why it has been a short integration path, or short, that it took so shortly. Let me address the next question to Dr. Herolf. Well, Finnish and Swedish military non-alignment was rooted in different geographies, histories and national identities. Swedish post-war policy mainly revolved around multilateral dialogue, mediation on the international stage, and nuclear disarmament. Therefore, military non-alignment became a large part of the Swedish identity. So we are witnessing a huge historic shift for Sweden. So what changed the 200 years belief of non-alignment, and why does it make sense? Why does it not make sense anymore?
Thank you very much for this question. I agree with your description of Sweden, but it's a partial one. There is also another thing that should be added, and that is, first of all, that Swedish non-alignment is a military non-alignment. It's not a political non-alignment. Sweden never saw itself as in the middle with equal distance between Russia and United States. Sweden was always a Western country, and Russia knew that very well. Russia could also see that the Swedish defense was entirely aiming at protecting the country and, if necessary, defend the country against Russia. We had no other potential enemies but Russia. During the Cold War, actually, the Swedish defense was very strong, and especially the Air Force, which was one of the major ones in Europe. We also had a prominent military industry, we still have. This was for the reason that, being a non-aligned country, you could never be quite sure to get the weapons. Should I be closer? Thank you. To get the weapons that we needed even from our friends, because they may need it themselves. So we had to produce them ourselves. And we had this situation until the end of the Cold War. And with the Cold War, of course, everything changed in Sweden, just as it did in many countries. Maybe our disarmament was more stronger than, it was definitely stronger than the Finnish one, but it was also very strong. In comparison with others, we'd had our illusions that Russia had changed. And we had those illusions for, I would not say 2008, I would say 2007, which was the first indication. It was the cyber attack against Estonia. And why Sweden saw it so easily was that it was directed against the banks, and the banks were Swedish. So that was no strange thing. In Georgia, 2008, we saw it again. And I remember that the Swedish Foreign Minister, Carl Bildt, was one of those who lashed out stronger against Russia than many other countries did. 2014, again, was, if we hadn't seen it before, that Russia had thoroughly changed, we saw it now. And this also had an effect on the Nordic cooperation, especially with Finland. We started to work more closely together. We knew that we may have to do a lot of things for our defense. We started rearming again. And then, of course, in 2022, or actually, as you started to say, Harri, it was 21 when we were told not only that we were not able to join NATO, also we were not allowed to move freely in our own neighborhood. We were told that we could not get too close to Russian aircraft, to Russian ships, which was a silly thing because they were the ones who came too close to ours compared to the routes. Now, NATO. As Harri said, we started also our close cooperation with NATO in 1994 in May, and actually Sweden and Finland were competing who were the first. So in order to keep us calm, they said, you can join on the same date, right? 10th of May. So no one could claim to be the first. And that we did. We started interoperability, we started very close cooperation, and in 2014 we took another step as kind of gold card members. Still, you have a point. There is an identity change that Sweden has had to go through, because people in general are used to seeing us as non-aligned, and still, many people did it. Just like in Finland, it was the population. We could see it in the polls that people said, now it's time for NATO. People realized that this is not World War I, when we can stumble into war. This is the equivalent of the period before World War II, when we have an aggressor who will not negotiate, as we try to do, France and Germany in particular. He was intent on increasing his power, and that was it. Right now in Sweden, we have a support for NATO above, just below 70%, slightly less than Finland. Those who are against it are, among the parties, are the Left Party and the Green Party. And if you look at people in general, we have some among the Social Democrats who saw the identity stronger, I believe, than the others did. But still, it's a very strong force against Sweden. We need NATO, and we are going to become members sooner or later.
Thank you very much. Let me bring the Georgian dimension into the discussion, and Tornike, well, Georgians who have been seeking for NATO membership for decades have been looking at this integration path with mixed feelings. What lessons can Georgia draw from the Nordic countries' experience towards NATO membership?
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity and for very, very interesting speakers. Well, probably there are very few countries around the globe which have been watching Finnish and Swedish road to NATO with more curiosity than Georgia. And it has two dimensions. One is practical, another is political. Let me start with the practical, then I'll go to political ones, which are equally important. From practical dimension, since the very day of the Finnish and Swedish announcement of the membership bid, and since the process was very clear that it was developing very successfully, very quickly, we started to analyze those specific things which those two countries have developed during those 20 years, which was mentioned here, which allowed them to proceed with, for example, Finland's road to NATO was the shortest in a post-Cold War enlargements. No other country has joined the alliance below 1 year threshold. You know. So we try to analyze, and those analyses show that, yeah, the years of engagement, high level of interoperability, institutions, the permanent engagement in NATO missions and operations, permanent engagement in different military structures. As you know, Finland and Sweden had a preferable regime of treatment among partner countries. They had possibility to post their staff members to different positions within the alliance. So we had in the international staff, from time to time, we had Finnish or Swedish VNCs serving in international or in VNC positions, which was later opened also for Georgia, and a couple of Georgian militaries had such a privilege to serve there as well. But all of those things in combination played a role, and for Georgia, obviously, it is a very useful example. And we are very thoroughly analyzing those processes. That golden card that those countries had, which allowed them to proceed so quickly. That practical aspect of it. And maybe last one in practical dimension, which is more political than anything else, is probably the map process, which Alexander mentioned, that proceeding without map. It was also important precedent because it was the first time since creation of the map that country joined the alliance without map process. But I've been advocating the approach that map it's not a problem. I've been doing it for many years, more than a decade. Very few people believe me, but my approach is that map is not a problem. If there is a political decision that Georgia becomes member, the map process will be very swift. Georgia has been in a map process for more than 11 years. The AMP map on the paper is AMP. We've been doing AMP since 2009. So map is over politicized in Georgia as many other things, and I think we should not be too much concerned about the map itself, but the precedent that country went into the alliance without map was very important. That was probably the political aspects of those integration processes, but most important was practical, but most important was political. What we have observed in political dimension. First of all, the so-called buffer zone idea was proved to be wrong. You know, this post-World War II approach to the issue that we leave something in between which is neutral, and nobody touches it, proved to be wrong. From Georgian perspective, that was very important. Another important aspect, the neutrality. Because probably all of you heard that if you turn on the TV, this marginal pro-Russian politicians still advocate in Georgia the idea of neutrality, that all our problems will disappear once we become neutral. Well, we had 2 cases of neutral countries in Europe with a very long, very successful history of neutrality, and both of them decided that it was time to end this policy. So in that context, it's also an additional argument in our hand. And one last thing, which is also interesting, probably all of you have heard also the argument about NATO getting closer to Russia's borders and calculating something, the flight time of the missile from certain point to Moscow and so on, which is all just misinformation, because if you look at the military technical point of view, there is no big difference whether Latvia is a member state or Georgia is a member state. So flight time to Moscow will be same. It does not change anything, but they tried to persuade that there is a rational reason behind their opposition. So in that context, you know, getting 1,300 plus kilometers of NATO-Russia border could play on Georgia's hand as well, because this argument of getting close to borders becomes obsolete. Yeah, I think to summarize, it was very interesting process to learn, to watch. I hope we learned a lot out of it. Very interesting precedents, and I think it will help other aspirant countries to move forward when the political decision is there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, although a map was mentioned as an integral part of Georgia's integration into NATO, I think it's important to focus what Georgia already has. And as you mentioned, Georgia has the annual national program, and Georgia has all the practical tools that it needs for its integration. So I think we should focus on what Georgia already has. So. Yes. So let me go with my next question to Dr. Bakur. Kvashilava. Well, the Finnish and Swedish integration into NATO showed that NATO's open door policy is real and in place. It also seems to override what has been by many seen as so-called Russian veto over further NATO expansion near its borders. The situation is changing rapidly, and it showed that window of opportunities are emerging in various directions. What should be the way forward for Georgia, taking the current change reality into consideration? Well, according to you.
Thank you for the question. It's undoubtedly a very difficult question to answer, and I cannot offer you that there will be some academic breakthroughs here. but only a common sense. And I'll try to answer the question, ponder about it really. So the first is that I think there was never an accepted idea that there really is a veto that Russia can actually employ in terms of NATO enlargement. But there was certainly a Russian influence and Russian position weighed heavily on the NATO members in 2008 when they denied Georgia membership plan. That is for sure. However, NATO always reiterated that there was no Russian veto, and that was probably true. Now what is happening is that this Russian position towards enlargement, which was always against in 1999, in 2004, every time NATO acquired new members, Russia was protesting. The difference was that when this protest carried the weight, when Russia was considered to be a strong and responsible partner, then France and Germany buckled in 2008. Now the situation has changed, but has it changed for Georgia? I will not be discussing this at this point because I will have an opportunity to do that sometime later. But let me turn now into what Georgian government should do, and as the question implies, isn't doing to get us closer to NATO. First of all, Georgia has to become a democracy. Georgia is not a democracy. There was a question about ANP and the democracy requirements there. Every government, this government, the government before it, always implicitly or indirectly in their statements would say that Georgia is a democracy, and democracy is some kind of a shades of democracy. And maybe we are at the beginning and not at the end. But the reality is different. Georgia has not been considered a democracy by any rankings that do an objective appraisal of a country. So one of the things that Georgia should do, the government should do, is make country a democratic country. Of course, there will be an objection there that Albania wasn't a democratic country in 2009, or Greece. But you know what? NATO, as well as EU, is not a university or a college where you are accepted by grades. You are accepted because it's a political decision. And the political decision should be such that it would be worth accepting a new member. It should bring more assets than it brings problems. And if you are coming with this coattail of authoritarian tendencies, patterns, that you are not consolidated democracy, it makes the position of skeptics stronger, and it makes your bid for membership less convincing. So that's one of the commonsensical recommendations that the government already knows, but I reiterate here. There is also another aspect. There is an aspect of foreign policy and domestic policy where the government should hold the commitments to join NATO's collective security umbrella as serious and not support, for example, the groups that were just mentioned, like, for example, the so-called people power, in their ridiculous attempts to further curb democracy in the country by introducing, some revanchist laws. And when the government party is supporting such initiatives, it makes you think that the government is trying to divide foreign policy and domestic policy for domestic audience and foreign audience, but in nowadays times it's impossible. You cannot tell the population, the NATO is not fair, EU is not fair towards us, we are not going to do recommendations because, they accepted Moldova and Ukraine on their word and not us. But, I believe that the communication here should be consistent and it should be unified, whether you are speaking in Brussels, in Washington, or in Tbilisi. And that is one of the things I think that the government should do and continue doing.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't know whether I would agree that Georgia is not a democracy, but I could certainly agree that more reforms are needed, and that for further Euro-Atlantic integration in that sense. Let me go back to Colonel Harri Paldanius. Finnish and Swedish integration path towards NATO, I see it as a win-win situation. For NATO, the two-nation expansion will add military assets to the organization, expand its boundaries, and increase the number of opponents Russia would face if it invaded a NATO member. Could you elaborate further how the Swedish and Finnish NATO membership will strengthen NATO, and what are the key assets Finland and Sweden bring with them? Thank you.
Right, thank you for the question. What do we bring for NATO? First of all, start with the civilian side. We bring two very strong democracies. We bring two nations that believe in the common values of the Western democracies. We bring two nations which see that these values have to be upheld even by force if necessary. Also, we'll bring the most happiest nation in the world. So, can't overestimate that one. Militarily, Finland and Sweden are both high technological nations. We have a strong militaries. We have been developing our militaries for centuries, for decades. And for what I say Finland, we never went to expeditionary warfare like everybody else in the West did. We never went for counterinsurgency. We were always upholding first the ability to offend and defend the nation and fight large formation land warfare with supported joint assets. It's very important, and now, as I say, several nations are coming to us to learn this way of fighting. How do you go back from counterinsurgency to normal war fighting skills? Also, what we're bringing in as two nations, we are bringing in more than 300,000 soldiers, multi-dimensional capability fighters with very high technological air force. Soon in the Nordic nations, in 5 years, we will have 3 nations with fifth generation air force, F-35s, more than 100 of them. And then we have the Swedish, very high technical 4.5 generation air force there. So we will have a joint air force capability. One say there will be no Viking fortress up north either. Sometimes you hear that people are saying we will put up this Viking fortress up here. First of all, Finns, we are not the Vikings. We fought the Vikings. We went to Russia, we fought the Russians, but we are not the Vikings. But still, we will bring a pack of nations that see the importance of cooperation. And this cooperation brings us a lot of things. Militarily, Finland and Sweden will bring depth. Now, for NATO, after our membership, it is possible to support and defend Baltic nations. Baltic nations are a peninsula between Russia, Belarus, and the Baltic Sea. Finland is an island at the end of the Baltic Sea, so we also need that one. And one thing that we've already created is a NATO inland sea. We never had that before. And for Russians, having a second NATO inland sea merging up in the Black Sea would be a disastrous thing, as we see already what happened in Ukraine. Just the basic idea of Ukrainian and Georgian NATO membership would create Black Sea as a also NATO inland sea. And for Russia, that is strategically a second thing they could not lose. They already lost the Baltics by making the miscalculations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Herolf, well, if I may say so, the abandoning the non-alignment was kind of an ideological change for Sweden, if I may call it so. Correct me if I'm wrong. So it might require a more deep-rooted transformation for Sweden. Will the NATO membership lead to a complete transformation of Swedish foreign and security policy, and how will the defense policy of Sweden change as a result of NATO membership?
Thank you for this question. First of all, I think Mr. Vinnikov has already answered this question by saying that there is within NATO a freedom to have one's own security and foreign policy. Sweden will continue to have the policy in these two areas that it has already been pursuing, and those were the ones you mentioned before. Multilateral dialogue, mediation is very close to a Swedish heart, and it's perfectly possible to continue. We have one example already in Norway, which has been a very successful mediator as a NATO member. This is no problem. And also you mentioned nuclear disarmament. Well, actually, NATO itself says it's for nuclear disarmament, even though this is not possible at the moment. And this is something that Sweden will also pursue to the extent that is possible in the difficult environment that we have today. But of course, Sweden will also have as a goal to be a loyal member of NATO in the areas where NATO has demands on Sweden, to see how the whole of NATO, the needs of the whole of NATO, not only to the needs of Sweden. And that is the major difference. We have been focusing for hundreds of years on our own goals. Now we have to focus on the goals, the interests, the needs of all NATO members. This is something that is often mentioned in Sweden as a goal by people saying we have to change our way of thinking, not only Sweden anymore. Just to remind us about that. We do have our own interests as well. And of course, our interests are the North, which is also, we hope, the interests of NATO, which NATO always says it is an advantage to get Sweden and Finland in because of our knowledge of our own area, not least the Arctic area, which is more strategic now than it has been for the last 30, 40 years. We have, in order to prepare ourselves for this, cooperated with the other Nordic countries, because as the military sees it, the four Nordic countries are one operational area. So the forces of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland have been working together for future cooperation, this time within NATO. We have one question mark, though. Will we be under Norfolk or will we be under Brønnøysund? Or worst of all, will they divide us? I don't know if Harri has an answer. You don't? I don't have. This is a big question mark because we don't want to be divided. So this is how we see it, and we hope that this will take place. Unfortunately, we had last week a little bit of a setback. We saw some statements from Turkey that seemed that what we had hoped for, that is a fast accession in October, we are not so sure anymore. We also see disinformation, and this is even worse, I would say. Disinformation about Sweden has, during the last week, been spreading all over Europe and also in the Middle East. And there are extraordinary things they say about Sweden, that Swedish authorities they kidnap Muslim children and give them to pedophiles. This is, you may agree with me that it sounds really, really weird, and of course it does not happen. But it's also repeated in solid media like Al Jazeera today. It is worrying Sweden. The Quran burnings is a very sad thing. We have a very wide freedom of expression in Sweden. We are looking what we can do, but we will never reduce our freedom of expression. We'll try to do what we can, because the Swedish authorities, unlike what is said in the newspapers, are extremely negative to these burnings. We wish they would stop, and we do what we can, but we have to follow our own laws. So we are worried. What has happened is, and what Sweden is worried about, are terrorist attacks, because we don't think any country will attack us, definitely not, but loonies may do and have already tried. And that is a real problem. We are asked not to go with headphones in our ears, and be careful, and call the police if something looks problematic. The police have already averted an attack against a church, which I find rather worrying. Stop there.
Thank you very much. Due to the time, I will go immediately to our to my next question to Bakur. Kvashilava, given Finland's proximity to Russia, what made the Finnish case different from Georgia and Ukraine, according to you?
Well, I'm forced to reiterate that first and foremost was that the regime type. Finland has been a consolidated democracy for a long time. It's not like my opinion against yours. It's just that we shouldn't believe what the current prime minister or the president says, but look at, for example, Freedom Index, Freedom in the World, or Polity 5, or Democracy Index by The Economist, or any other ranking that shows where the countries are situated. And according to that, Georgia is a hybrid country, and Finland has been a consolidated democracy. Apart from this, obviously, there is an economy, there is a GDP per capita, there is militaries that has been discussed, and military technologies that has been available to Finland for a long time. There is a history of statehood and self-rule, even during the Russian Tsarist empires that Finland enjoyed. There is a territorial depth that Finland has. There is a geography, the neighbors to the west, while Georgia is situated in a completely different geopolitical area. And after all, we have to ask ourselves a hypothetical question. Was it that NATO accepted Finland, or Finland decided to join NATO? Imagine that in 1999, when Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO, or in 2004, when Baltic republics made the second wave. Was Finland not ready? Maybe not ready politically as a decision, internal decision by the Finnish people, but Finland was obviously ready, and they would be accepted. Because if NATO and Russia at that moment accepted that former Soviet republics joined NATO, they would agree, of course, joining Finland, that has been neutral even during the Cold War. It hasn't been even part of an Eastern Europe communist bloc. So that is a difference that this hypothetical question clearly shows. So membership in any organization, including NATO, is a two-way street. And our main idea, our governments, our people, our nation, is to make sure that Georgia is as welcome as Finland, and for this we have to build a democratic and strong country. That's the end of it. And of course there are the such inconveniences as the territorial problems, right? Finland didn't have them. There was and there is a territorial integrity problem with Georgia. Obviously there is an example of West Germany. Of course I know about that. But making West Germany part of NATO was worth it. It was a political decision. So making Georgia joining NATO, accepting Georgia in NATO, will be a political decision, and it should be worth it. We should make it worth it. It will be more difficult for us to join than for Finland was, but I think it shows that it's still possible. That's my point.
Thank you for a lot of good points. Last questions from my part. Tornike, the Euro-Atlantic integration anchored in Georgian constitution and which is also supported by overwhelming majority of Georgian society. What challenges and opportunities do you see for Georgia considering the emerging new order?
Well, there are very few countries which suffer from Russian war in Ukraine, against Ukraine, more than Georgia does. The European security architecture, which was formed after the end of the Cold War, collapsed for Georgia at the very beginning, in early 90s. It never existed for Georgia, but at least at the level of statements, it was still there until some time. In 2008, we had the last harsh reminder that there was no security order at all, but somehow it was put aside by all of us. So now challenges only increased, and that is very clear. But at the same time, I do believe the current situation comes with opportunities as well. The collapse of the system, I think, will be definitely lead us to the creation of the better system, which will fit not only interests of the allies and other partners, but of the countries aspiring to membership as well. Will create, first of all, as Alexander said, in reality, the situation where nations can decide for themselves their foreign policy choice. I think it will end up with more opportunities once the war is won in Ukraine, but we have to make it till there, and we have to make sure that Ukraine wins this war. Otherwise, the consequences might be very difficult to face for everybody, not only for Ukraine. For Georgia, I don't want even to speculate about it. But most important events will start when it happens, when we sit around the table to negotiate the new security architecture. It is obvious that they will try to limit their defeat to Ukraine, to make sure that it is limited to Ukraine and that's it. In 2008, we made a mistake that Georgia was perceived as an isolated case. Now, my worst fear is that Ukraine will be perceived as an isolated case, and resolving Ukraine will result into happiness around the table. I think that's the biggest threat that we are facing, that once it's over, and once Ukraine wins this big fight, everybody will be so happy that countries like Georgia or some others who suffered from the same disease will be left aside, or will be left in hanging in between. That's the biggest fear which comes to my mind when you talk about new security architecture. If we repeat the same question which we did, we will get another Ukraine or another Georgia sometime very soon. So I'll give you a very simple example. Nobody questions that Ukrainian territories are annexed and occupied, but there is no same term used with regard to Georgia. Somehow 10,000 of Russian troops on the territory of Georgia are breakaway troops, but troops on the Ukrainian territory are occupation forces or annexation forces. There is no document which is endorsed by consensus within NATO or within the European Union, which says occupied territories of Georgia. There you see where my fears come from, that I'm not paranoid, but have very specific reason for that. Let's hope that this last big wake-up call, which is still ringing on, will change that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving this angle to this discussion and to give us good food for thoughts about the situation. Well, let me now go to the audience. Please, before speaking, introduce yourself very shortly, because we have guest speakers who might not know you. So go here.
I'm misusing my opportunity at this conference. Kvashilava from the University of Georgia. I have one comment and one question to actually all of the participants. First of all, the question of the problem of Russian influence versus Russian veto. I think it is still dependent on the amount of Russian caviar and vodka you did consume. So, former German chancellor or Austrian former minister would certainly confirm that. So the second question goes to the participant about the practicalities of actually Finnish and Swedish defensibility during this period when they enjoyed the neutral status, but actually got the very convincing mechanism supported by NATO in form of NORDEFCO, Nordic Defense Committee, where also Norway and Denmark were heavily involved to increase the defensibility of neutral countries, which means that NATO countries were directly engaged in a very practical military mechanism that would ensure the defensibility and security of these countries in case of major invasion, which we, Georgia, do not have for the moment. Do you think that Georgia would utilize this very practical mechanism? Let's call it Black DEFCO, Black Sea Defense Committee, where Turkey or some other Black Sea countries would be kind of participate and create a kind of platform that would ensure that defensibility and deterrence of Georgia in this transitional period until we got the direct membership is strongly confirmed, also by NATO countries. Thank you.
Shall I take two more questions and then answer them together?
Okay, right. NORDEFCO. NORDEFCO is a cooperation that actually started as a NORDCAPS in 1960s. So it is very long strand of cooperation between the Nordic nations. It started with peace support operations training, where the Nordic nations just divided that Finland would train the UN observers, Sweden would train the staff officers, Denmark would do the military police training, Norway would do something else. So it started like this. It became NORDEFCO. It was still lots of training and then acquisitions. The whole idea within NORDEFCO was to make joint acquisitions, and very sad example of this is the Nordic joint helicopter acquisition called NH90. Driven by the Danes, it started at late 90s, ended up having 3 different helicopters. The Danes jumped out of the whole business. Finland took the basic NH90, Norwegians took the one that was a maritime operational, and the Sweden took one that was a bit higher than everybody else's. So only thing common to this whole helicopter was letters NH and number 90. But NORDEFCO itself has proven to be pretty useful tool. We've had possibilities to have a military-to-military discussions. The chief of defenses have had their own meetings within this cooperation. And the main thing here came out was the deep defense cooperation between Finland and Sweden. We practically have now a joint navy. Our navies are training daily. We practically have a joint air force. We had daily exercises up north with Swedish and Finnish squadrons. Norwegians came in, and when everybody figured out that's nice, Americans came in, the Brits came in, the Germans will come in, French will want to come in. And of course, we also give you a possibility to fly up north, which is very empty. Nobody will be bothered, just some couple 100,000 reindeers, but that's not much. But Nordefco is a good platform, and if it's possible to do these certain platforms to support your development, I say that is great. Go ahead and do so.
I agree with everything, of course. I could add a few things. When there were all 5 of us, because Iceland were there somewhere as well, because even though they don't have any military forces, it was of a limited value, because it was so obvious that we could not, there was a limit, because Norway, Denmark, Iceland were NATO. There was no possibility for those 3 countries to promise any cooperation in wartime. We were working with other things. What I would say was the most valuable things with Nordefco was that it created a possibility, just you have mentioned, Harri, when, for example, first Finland and Sweden, but then also the cooperation between the 3 air forces, Norway, Sweden and Finland, which has been going on for, I think, close to 10 years. If, say, there is an attack up in the north, those air forces are there already. They can immediately help to avert an attack. And later on came similar cooperation also with Denmark. So we have Denmark, Norway and Sweden, which was fairly much dealing with the marine issues. But having Nordefco as a foundation, as a kind of organizing unity among it all was very useful for these things, which developed fairly recently. But it was valuable, even though many of us didn't see it as particularly valuable during the bad helicopter years, I would say.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, so yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson from Norway. I think we have our Nordefco here in Georgia. It's called a Substantial NATO Georgian Package after the summit in Wales in 2014. For instance, Norway have been present here since 2016. That's 7 years. So we have 18 initiatives going on right now, and we have finalized a few. So I think just a comment for your questions about where is the Nordefco in Georgia, I will say it is SNGP. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you for posing the questions. And I will give the floor to the next moderator, Sandro Megrelishvili. Please come forward.